So first I want to just frame, I should introduce myself. My name is Etta King, and I'm the Education Program Manager here at JWA. And I want to start by framing this a little bit for those of you that are less familiar with JWA's work. So this blue text here is the mission of the Jewish Women's Archive. And our work is really about uncovering the stories of American Jewish women and making them known and inspiring change within the Jewish community and the American community through the stories of these women. And a huge part of how we do that and a huge part of our theory of change is sort of rooted in the educational work that you're doing. And so because of that, you're essential partners for us in this work. You're the people who are on the ground, working in the trenches every day. And it's really through you and your creativity and your passion that the change and transformation of our community is catalyzed. And it's only through you that Jews of all ages in your communities that you serve begin to see a larger narrative, a more inclusive narrative of the Jewish people. And I think that relates to our work, and that our job in the education department here at JWA is really to help you figure out how to create these encounters with students. And sort of the core part of our education work is really looking at the intersection of this person's story, a historical figure, somebody who I share a cultural legacy with, and providing opportunities to encounter those people through their personal stories for our students, so that questions about who these people are inform an investigation of who our students are and who they want to be in the world through a Jewish lens, and really do that from a Jewish place in which could have a very broad definition. So that's just a 2-second intro to our work here. A few goals for this program, and I apologize in advance, this program is a little more frontal than most of our other programs, so there are going to be a few opportunities for sort of interaction and activity. But first I just wanted to lay out a couple goals here, because the main goal is really to model some activities for you and give you some practical resources that you'll be able to take and put to use immediately in your communities in various ways. So we're going to throw out a lot of ideas and throw out a lot of resources, and then you'll make use out of those as you see fit. And our job is to support you in doing that. And also to think creatively about how to bring oral history or story collecting to your students, how, why that might be important. And in the second half of the program today, we'll have Susan Cohen, who is here participating with us, talk a little bit about a program that she put together, and hopefully between her spiel and my spiel, we'll get some creative juices flowing, and that will help us sort of start to think more broadly about the role that community history and storytelling can play in our education work. So first, just to make sure we're all on the same page about stories, stories are such an essential part of Jewish culture and of the Jewish tradition. We've been telling our story for hundreds, thousands of years, really. And, we tell stories about creation, we tell stories of the Exodus, we tell stories about homeland and peoplehood, about persecution and about celebration. And all of those different stories make up the canon and rich written and oral tradition that Judaism has. And Judaism is really about understanding who we are because we know our past. That's like a reoccurring theme. It's very central, of course, to the Passover story, but also to Jewish culture in general. And we decided to have this program now because next week we are going to be celebrating 2 holidays which sort of exemplify storytelling moments, both for us as Americans and as Jews. So we have Thanksgiving, which is the iconic story of American bounty and freedom, and for some people a more critical reading of that story about a complicated and checkered past with colonization and sort of oppression of other people and how that interplays with the idea of freedom that's very American. And then we also have the story of Hanukkah, which is more prominent in American Judaism than in some other places. We as American Jews really like hold tight to that story of Hanukkah, but the themes in the story of Hanukkah are really central to the stories overall in Judaism. Themes about freedom, about resistance, about this complicated relationship that we have with God. And so this seemed like a good time to sort of throw another kind of storytelling into the mix. And one thing that I think is important to note about stories is the only reason we can tell stories is if we know them. And so either they're passed down to us through oral tradition or they're somehow recorded. And that's really how JWA comes to the work of storytelling, is thinking about this idea of whose stories are told and whose stories are recorded and shared. So over the years, JWA has done several different oral history collecting projects featuring the stories of American Jewish women. So we did Weaving Women's Words in a couple different cities, focusing on sort of community leaders and women who made a really big impact sort of in their communities. And then we did Women Who Dared, which focused on women who were sort of trailblazing or doing social justice work. And then we also, after Hurricane Katrina, did both an object collecting project and an oral history collecting project about the impact of Hurricane Katrina on Jews in the South, in Louisiana and in the Mississippi Delta. And all of those are collections that we have available on our site that if you want to sort of interact with them, will point you in the direction of those. And so those are the oral histories that we do. Another organization that does a lot of story collecting that you may have heard of is StoryCorps, which does a different kind of story collecting. So we differentiate at JWA between oral history and story collecting, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. But StoryCorps is very rich. Their model has been very successful in terms of bringing people together and sharing sort of shorter stories about a specific idea or topic or event. So we'll talk a little bit more about the resources that they have available. But, I think it all comes down to this question of why do we collect people's stories? And if you have some ideas about why we do this collecting, sort of we as a society or we as people in general do this collecting, feel free to type that into the chat. I'd love to sort of hear your take on why if it's important to collect stories and why. And then I'll talk a little bit about why we think it's important as JWA. So to have a sense of lived history, Ellie's writing in, self-affirmation, ways of dealing with reality. So we learn ways of dealing with reality. We have a need for understanding our legacy and teaching people about it. Yeah, certainly preserving our history is a big part of it, especially I think thinking about it within the Jewish community or through community collecting projects. Yeah, and to learn from the past. So all of those are important things, I think, especially as educators, for us to keep in mind as goals. Feel free to keep typing in the chat. I'm going to plow through here. But I like to think of history as a lot of different moving parts. So we have history that's documented in books. We have history that's sort of captured in historical documents, whether those are preserved in a museum or are somewhere where no one can find them in a basement or trunk somewhere. And then we have the personal stories that are collected through oral history and shared through the oral tradition. And it's through those personal stories that we are able to really have something specific that informs the grand narrative. And then the grand narrative informs each individual story. And so by bringing personal stories and oral history into our teaching about history, we're drawing some personal connections and putting faces and descriptive emotion-based experiences in parallel with sort of the broader themes that we may be talking about. So, for example, learning about the civil rights movement, we can learn facts and we can learn dates and we can learn about sit-ins and Freedom Summer and the March on Washington. And then if we have an oral history, to really hear from one particular person, what was it like to be at the March on Washington? What was it like to be on the bus riding into segregated South? That gives us sort of a deeper connection, something really specific to latch onto. At JWA, we also think about this quote from Winston Churchill, history is written by the victors. And the work that we've done with oral history at JWA is really about counteracting this idea. So history, recorded history, or the historical record is really dominated by people who have traditionally or historically been in power, people who have won wars, people who have been leading countries and creating and enforcing social systems. And through oral history, we can actively go out and pursue voices that are not included in that. So in the Jewish community, one example of this is collecting the oral histories of Holocaust survivors. In the 1930s, right after, or in the 1930s, there was a sort of surge of collecting former oral histories from former slaves in the US. I put Rose Schneiderman here, who's a labor activist in the early part of the 20th century, and she's really somebody who sort of encapsulates laborers, people from the working class, right? People who aren't part of the dominant historical narrative. And of course, JWA is interested in women and interested in having the stories of women which haven't traditionally been preserved, especially within Jewish institutions or sort of told within the Jewish narrative. So that's how we come to this work. I think it's also worth noting, given that we're all educators here, thinking about what story collecting can do for our students and the power that story collecting can have sort of as a pedagogical tool and method. So there are a few things that I think about there. One is this idea that it's an emergent learning program, right? So students are interviewing people, they're following their own curiosity. They get to decide who's the interviewer, who they're interviewing rather, what questions they're going to ask, what they want to focus on, and then from there they get to build personal connection with that. There are also a lot of skills balled into the process. So there's skills about active listening, there's skills about developing good questions and drawing inferences. There are some skills about if you're doing oral history and you're sort of putting it in the context of historical research, there's skills there about researching things and drawing connections, again, between that sort of historical background and the individual experience. And so all of those, I think, sort of roll into this really nice, well-rounded package of things that students get out of this experience. There's also something interesting about emotional health and the emotional growth of our students. Over the summer, I was reading this study from Emory's online journal of family life, and I just want to make sure that I'm saying it right here. So there's the study that was done showed that kids who knew more about their family history and about how their relatives struggled and overcame obstacles had higher self-esteem and a greater sense of control over their lives. So what that tells us is that young people learn from the accomplishments and mistakes of their predecessors, especially those in their family. And by creating opportunities for our students to engage intentionally and meaningfully in those kinds of conversations, we're actually giving them an opportunity to cultivate skills for solving their own problems, making decisions, and living in a way that feels healthy and happy and aligned with who they are. And lastly, and Susan's going to talk about this a little bit in her presentation, and this in some ways I think is the most obvious thing, is that we're helping our students build relationships with people. And that's a two-way relationship. So the student is building a relationship with the person they're interviewing, and the interviewer is building a relationship with, or the narrator is building a relationship with the student. So that's really two ways, and that especially when interviewing community members or family members who are older, um, those people can serve as role models in various ways. So even if you don't want to grow up to be the same thing that this person was, you can say, I want to be brave. I want to be courageous. I want to, speak out for what I believe in or pursue my dreams. And that's really important. And so through oral history, interviews, and story sharing, we really give our students an opportunity to connect with people who they want to emulate. Before I move on, I just want to pause and see if there are any questions so far. I see a few people are typing into the chat. And feel free, as I said, to ask questions as we go along. Yeah, and so I just want to hold up this observation that Michal is making, thinking about not doing enough to support parents as storytellers. So we'll have a chance to think a little bit more about this at the end, but it's interesting to think about, in this program, we're really talking about how to help students draw out those stories, but we really haven't done such a great job maybe of helping people understand how to tell their own stories. So there's another side to that maybe we'll have to explore in a future program. So I've been talking a lot about story collecting versus oral history, and I think it's just worth it to make a distinction between those two things. So oral history is really it's something used by historians. It involves doing a good deal of external research, both before and after the collecting process. So you have the person you're interviewing fill out a pre-interview questionnaire outlining facts about their lives and biographical details that you can then ask about. You're going to be doing some historical research about what was going on in the area where this person was living and in their life, and you sort of learn about that in order to place the person's story in context. And then you record the interview. A lot of people will transcribe it. Most people log it somewhere, or, in a library or institution. You create a website for yourself. It's really about sort of contributing to the historical record in this sort of grander way. And that's something that I think is really worth pursuing on some level, especially for working with adults or with students. It really is about the time frame that you have. So this is something that's a great focus if you have an ongoing project, if you're allowed to assign homework for your students, which I know not everyone is allowed to, and if you're interested in sort of making it a little meatier. And I should also say that JWA doesn't put like a stamp of approval on one thing or the other. So, we think both of these are really great methods. Story collecting takes a little bit less time. It's usually, talking about one idea or one event, at least how we've thought about it here. There's not necessarily all this historical research going on. And for that reason, it's easier to share. It's easier, especially for younger students, to do. Like one of the resources that we'll give you a link for later has a case study about a school that just had students go around and ask people to talk about like the Shema and what the Shema meant to them. Short, sweet, and impactful, but not at the same level that that we talk about with oral history. And really quickly, I'm just going to mention these resources and we'll give you links to them later. But JWA has tools for helping guide you through both of those processes. So if you're interested in oral history, we have our oral history guide called In Our Own Voices. And if you're interested in doing something smaller scale or something working with younger students, we have similar language that's been adapted for younger audience in our family history toolkit. And we'll be sending all of these links to you so you can explore those on your own time. So now I'm going to get into the nitty-gritty part of the presentation, and in a minute we're going to do a quick activity. So I've already sort of mentioned these two roles. We have the role of the narrator in oral history and the role of the interviewer. So the narrator is the person who's telling the story, and the interviewer is the person who is asking them questions. It's pretty straightforward. Um, when I'm introducing this concept to students, sometimes it's nice to have them interview each other, just one or two questions, and sort of practice feeling what that's like, being the interviewer and being the narrator and talking a little bit about that. I also like to think of sort of a third entity that exists, which is the relationship that's built between these two people, the back and forth that the interviewer is listening and sort of being respectful of the offer that the narrator is making, and at the same time, the narrator is offering very freely of themselves and authentically and putting that trust in the interviewer. Um, and an essential part of this process is about developing good questions to ask. And in the resources we'll give you, there are many, many, many lists of questions. And online, there are many lists of questions that you'll be able to pull from. But I thought it would be fun just for us to do a little activity together, thinking about the kinds of questions that we want to ask. So I'm going to pull up a whiteboard here. And what I'm going to ask you to do is either by unmuting yourself and saying it out loud or writing in the chat, just put out some questions that you would ask someone if you wanted to learn more about how and why they came to be a Jewish educator. So go ahead and throw that out. Throw out some questions, and I'm going to put them up on the whiteboard here. And right now, this is an activity that I'm modeling that you could do with your students to introduce the concept of asking and developing questions here. Okay. These are great questions. Let's get a few more here. Great. Some good questions here. I'm going to put two more in here, and then I'm going to pause and we're going to talk about it. Feel free to keep putting more in the chat. I'll come back and add them to this list later. Great. Okay, so I'm actually going to move this over to here. Okay, great. So a couple more questions coming in. I promise I will add them to the list. So you'll notice that I've put these in two categories. What do you observe about the two categories, the way that I've grouped the questions? Feel free to sort of speak up or to type into the chat. So Lisa's saying B is about education in the classroom. Yeah, so that is one definite difference. Not what I was going for. A is personal. Ellie's saying A is about formative experiences. Yeah, a little bit. Again, not exactly the distinction I was trying to make. So Susan wrote in, and Susan has some experience with this, so and has done some training with us with this before. But I'm gonna pull out what her answer was. So what we try to do when we're helping people learn how to write questions is differentiate between a closed question and an open question. Um, so in column A, we have, to the best distinction that I could make, closed questions, and in column B, we have open questions. And basically what that means is it means that closed questions are questions that have a definite answer. Who was your favorite teacher? Mrs. Schoonover, first grade, right? It's a really easy question for us to answer. But a follow-up question, an open-ended question to that is why? Why were they your favorite teacher? What about them? Who was your role model? My mom. What about your mom made you look up to her? So it's important when we're preparing questions and our students are preparing questions for interviews to get a good list going of both closed questions and open questions for a few reasons. One, the closed questions are important. Where were you born? Where did you go to school? What was your community like? Those sorts of things that are pretty concrete give us the context for then exploring more deeply a story. The open questions are the questions that get at the meat and the heart of that person's experience. So I'm going to hide this, but don't worry, we will make sure to share the whiteboard with you because I want to just go back to our PowerPoint here to talk a little bit about what we call the 1-2 punch method. So the key in developing these two kinds of questions, open-ended and closed-ended questions, is to switch them off with each other. So where did you grow up? Ann Arbor, Michigan. And then what was it like? What was it like in Ann Arbor to grow up there? And talking a little bit about that. And then that allows us to draw some questions about, how someone came to leave their hometown or what they went on to be because of that. Also, asking closed-ended questions that have sort of clear and concrete answers gives the narrator a break from constantly having to sort of reflect and recall and share their experience. It's an easy answer, at least in theory, depending on how great your memory is, right? But it also creates a structure that allows the interviewer to follow the narrator's lead. So if they start in an open-ended question talking about something, to follow that lead and ask some more questions there, and also to let the interviewer ask some questions really about what they want to know, and direct the conversation in that way. Questions about open and closed-ended? Okay, great. So Miriam, I'm going to ask you to jump in here. And another activity that I want to model for you is this activity that I call what not to do. Usually I like to frame things positively for students, like you can walk quietly in the hallway or whatever. But this is a fun activity, and through role playing gives students the chance to see really why we say not to do some of these things. So in this scenario, Miriam is going to be the interviewer, and I'm going to be the narrator, and she's just going to role play one of the things not to do.
So when did you first become a Jewish
Miriam,
educator?
we can't hear you. Oh, sorry.
Let's see. Is my microphone on? Can everyone
hear
me?
There was just a lag time. No, you're good.
Is it okay now?
So you do your thing and I will be patient.
All right. So Etta, when did you first become a Jewish educator, and who were some of your influences?
Wow. Okay. So I think I first became a Jewish educator sort of inadvertently at summer camp. It was something that people really cultivated, Oh, you did. That's great.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Trying to remember the other question. Oh, who were some of my influences? So, I have a couple people that I think about, I guess camp counselors were certainly influences. My grandmother, who's a Jewish educator, but I don't think I really purposely became a Jewish educator.
Hmm.
So great. So that was good, Miriam. So Miriam was, well, Miriam, why don't you tell us what you were modeling there? Uh-oh. Okay, I think we lost Miriam. We thought this might happen. The internet connectivity at our office seems to not be so great. um, so I'm just going to move on and just talk about the other scenarios. So usually what I do is I pick, so I ask students to volunteer and come up in pairs to the front of the class, and I assign one of them to be the interviewer and one of them to be the narrator. And I have these little situations written out on sheets, and I encourage the students to sort of ham it up. So one is asking too many questions at one time, you know? Why did you want to be a Jewish educator? What inspired you? Who inspired you? When did you do that? Right? When we do that too quickly, it doesn't allow the narrator to process what's going on. Um, Also, interrupting the narrator. So it's important to pause and let that wait for sort of a natural place to then ask your next question. Another thing is we want to try to be nonverbal when we're acknowledging the narrator. So instead of saying, yeah, totally, me too, blah, 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 we want to just do things like smile and nod. Or if they're telling a not so happy story, show concern on your face um, and do it that way. That's for a few reasons. One, going back to not wanting to interrupt their train of thought. And two, if you're making an audio or video recording, anything that you add interrupts that. So later, people are going to be hearing part of you in addition to the person's story, and it interferes with that. Um, Also, the last two I think are very complicated and challenging, especially for adults who really want to engage in conversation with one another. But offering the interview itself is not a place to offer your own experiences or to try to draw some conclusions or inferences around sort of what's going on. It's really a place for the narrator to share. And that's why I think it's important for us when we're thinking about these programs to build in opportunities for students to reflect on the process and on what they learned that's not in the interview. Perhaps an opportunity to share or have a more informal meeting with the person who's their narrator, maybe a coffee date or a tea party before or after before or after the interview process, just so that they can get to know each other a little bit better, and also some sort of written reflection, I think, on what did you learn about this person, and what does that mean? How does that relate to their story, our community's story, history in general, etc. So this is a fun activity that I want to sort of introduce. So really quickly, I'm just going to mention that we, in addition to the stuff that JWA has online, there are several other online resources from StoryCorps and from the Contemporary Jewish Museum. This Stories of Survival packet is a great resource for those of you that are looking for 21st century tools that sort of bring technology in to share some of the stories that you're collecting. And I also just want to mention that collected oral histories, whether we've collected them or someone else has, provide a sort of rich Jewish text from which our students can study and discuss Jewish values, Jewish identity. So we've also included some resources about where you can find those online. Any questions now before we move on to the next part of the program? Okay, great. So Susan, this is going to be your part now. So go ahead and turn on your webcam. And while Susan is doing that, I wanted to just introduce her quickly to you. So Susan Cohen became the director of education at Temple, or at the Masad Shalom Religious School at Temple Adat Shalom in 2005. Um, Before that, she worked for 10 years in Chicago as the director of high school education for the Chicago Community Foundation for Jewish Education. And she's also worked in both Tucson, Arizona and Syracuse, New York in Jewish education administration. She has a master's in education administration from the University of Arizona. And Susan came to us in 2010 to participate in our 5-day intensive professional development program called the Institute for Educators. And after that program, she was inspired to go and start her own oral history project in her community, which she calls the Scholar Society. So she's going to talk briefly about that just to sort of plant some seeds in your brains and share about her work. And then we're going to try to end with 5 or 10 minutes for questions. So take it away, Susan.
Good morning, everyone. Am I coming through okay, Etta?
Yes, absolutely.
Good. So I'm very, very excited to be asked to share this program with you. It's an intergenerational program to empower teenage girls and connect them to role models through oral history. Want to go back a little bit to needs and goals and talk about how this came about. As Etta mentioned, in 2010, I was at the Jewish Women Archives Summer Institute. But actually, the seed for this project that we have was planted in 2009 when in our local community, the San Diego area, the Jewish Women's Foundation convened focus groups of rabbis and educators and community leaders asking the question, what are the key needs facing Jewish women and girls? And what came out of those focus groups is that the needs of teenage young women were a resounding priority in our community. So the Jewish Women's Foundation, San Diego Jewish Women's Foundation, put out in 2010 an announcement of for community people to submit a letter of intent with describing a program that would meet the needs of teenage girls. And, once again, stars being aligned. It was just one of those situations, one of those fortuitous situations where the letter of intent was asked for. I'm coming to Jewish Women's Archive in Boston for the Institute, and I meet some amazing educators. As I told Etta, I looked around that table and I thought, what am I doing here? But the reality was I was there, and I learned a great deal about storytelling and learned how powerful it was, spoke to a lot of my colleagues, and spoke to Judith Rosenbaum, who at that time was the director, I don't know exactly what her title was, about this opportunity in San Diego and asked if the Women's Archive would be interested in working on that with me. And they were. And so we put together a letter of intent. Our project was selected. We put together a proposal. And this program that I'm going to describe to you grew out of that proposal. It's a 3-year grant, and we are now in the final year of that grant. So the proposal guidelines had some very specific things that needed to be included, and that's how we built our project. We had to incorporate adult facilitators and experts in whatever field we were working in. They looked for a project that could enhance a college application. These were all, there was, as you know, when you write a proposal or a grant, there's always like this list of bullet points, things to include. These were the items that we included. Outreach to the community, incorporating Jewish values, being sensitive to the teen time constraints, incorporate opportunities for girls to interact with role models. It could not be an individual program of a synagogue. You had to have partners. And so the recommendation actually came from my rabbi. He said, why don't we do it cross-denomination and see if that indeed would work? And so our project is involving girls from the Reform movement, the conservative movement. Well, I should say from a Reform congregation, my congregation, conservative congregation, and Chabad institution. And so we put all these things together. We had this collaboration cross denomination. We had our institutions were in kind of an outline area, not in the main corridor of the Jewish world in San Diego. And we had the written support from the Jewish Women's Archive. And I got to tell you, with all those players, we hit a home run and we were funded. So I guess maybe, I don't know, at this point, I'll just go to one of the other ideas that we have for the under needs and goals. We created a program that for girls to connect with others cross community, and that was the cross denomination program. The program was for for girls to honor an older woman by asking her story and then retelling that story in a creative way, whatever way the girl wanted to choose. I can tell you that for the most part, these girls were very homogeneous. The girls who wanted to do this were girls who were obviously college bound, um, motivated, busy, and looking for a unique opportunity. In our congregation, our rabbi actually in, sent a letter of invitation to the girls because we wanted to be a very high level where the girls felt that they were being invited to do something very special and unique. Um, so
Yeah, Susan, this is your 10-minute warning.
10 minutes, okay. So um, I think, what I wanted to do was maybe talk a little bit about what over time has occurred and hasn't occurred. And the develop relationships is something that we're still working on simply because our program is so structured that there's not a lot of time. We're more task oriented in the project. So maybe we'll go to the next slide
Okay.
and so we talked about the participants from 3 different congregations. We talked about the local funder, and who was, the Jewish Women's Foundation of San Diego. And I'll talk a little bit about what we did, in terms of the project. We have 4 monthly sessions. Um, and that originally we started with 5, but once again, that piece of the girls' time, we were very constrained by AP tests, um, final exams, Passover, all kinds of things. The program really is very tight in that we do the whole project now in four meetings plus the interview. And then at the end of the project, we have the Scholars Symposium where girls come together and present the project, the story of the person who they interviewed. We have an application. We ask the girls to choose someone from another generation. That question about a mom and interviewing parents. So far, we have not had any girls interview parents. And in fact, this part of who the girls interview was a total surprise to me. I thought every girl would choose her grandma. Of course, her grandma. I'm a grandma. So, I want my granddaughter to choose me. But that wasn't the case. That isn't the case. 1/3 of the girls choose a grandma or close relatives. That would be an aunt, or an aunt really, or their grandmother. Another third of the girls chose somebody from their congregation, someone who they know in the world of their Jewish education life, whether it's the 95-year-old woman who is in charge of ONEG, or it is a teacher, We have had our cantor be honored. So, and we call them honorees. I know that the language is interviewer and narrator, but our girls got very confused because they felt that when they did the project, they were the narrator. So the storyteller really is the girl. So we kind of changed that around to meet our needs, and we call them the interviewer and the honoree because these indeed are women who are being honored. So the first session, we get the girls together and we tell them to bring an artifact, an item from their life, and tell their first story. And the stories that these girls tell from the beginning are so compelling. They bring an item like something, well, we had wildfires. One girl once brought an item that she rescued from the fire of her home. It was a Hanukkah. One girl brought a necklace that belonged to her mother. Her mother had passed away. Another girl brought her black belt. So once again, the idea that these girls are really highly motivated girls who get it from the get-go is something that needs to be considered in terms of the huge success of this program. So we tell stories. We also, at that first meeting, we used to have a whole session for this, but now we have a half a session. We go to the Jewish Women's Archive website and we look at examples of, and this is put together in advance, of women and famous, some of them are famous women, Barbara Streisand, some of them aren't so famous, but their story and what they did in history, just to give the girls an idea. And we usually look for an athlete because a number of our girls are athletes. We look for a writer. Our girls love to write. We look for the kinds of interests that our girls have, to find that on the Jewish Women's Archive website. And we talk a little bit about that. And then we go into a second session, which is an oral history workshop. And our first year of funding, we brought in someone from the Jewish Women's Archive. She wrote
Susan, I just want to let you know you have 4 minutes left.
4 minutes. Okay, so we do the oral history workshop, and in the workshop, the girls learn about how to do an interview. They all the things that Etta said. It's very professional. We ask everybody to sign a release form, borrowed materials receipt. It's very, very professional. Each girl gets a digital recorder to use for her interview. And then we allow 1 month for the girls to do their interviews. They come together in a putting it together session, and we talk about how they're going to tell the story. And they can tell the story whatever way they want, whatever way lends itself to this woman and to her story and to what the girls are comfortable with. It can be essay, PowerPoint, art, a piece of art, music, pottery, sculpture, whatever way the girls want to portray this woman's life and and either tell it through that media or show it through that media. That's what they are allowed to do. And then we have our symposium, and that's the final culmination. And the final culmination is pretty amazing. We put together a brochure. We ask each girl to write an impact statement and tell us indeed how this experience impacted them. You can see a couple of the impact statements and pictures of the girls and their honoree on the screen. We had Auntie Bobby, her story was told, and the impact it had on her niece was, you don't always know someone as well as you think you do. Our Cantor Lori, her story was told by a young, I think actually 11th or 12th grader. Cantor Lori has no children. The fact that this young girl actually told her story about how she came to be, clergy and a cantor in our congregation was truly amazing and a great honor to the cantor. And one of, I think, our hardest stories was one of our girls had decided to honor someone who's very high profile in our community, someone who was actually involved with the Jewish Women's Foundation. This woman passed away very suddenly,
Mm.
and her husband agreed to be interviewed about her, and what the impact on Rachel, who told this story, was that knowing Gail's story changed her views of what one woman's action can accomplish. She learned that there are no limitations to what you can do. So, I mean, I can tell you, as you can hear, it's there's a lot of moving parts, and I have educators from Chabad and from the conservative congregation who work with me. We're truly a partnership. We discovered all the girls are alike. There's not anything significantly different. And that's a really wonderful thing for our girls to know, that the synagogue down the street or across the way, where they don't go to, where they aren't members, indeed they meet girls just like themselves. So it is a very powerful experience on so many different levels. What is the impact on me? Well, let me see. I wrote that down so I could just I could just, first of all, I think this is such an important project. And I'm not Steven Spielberg, and we're not the Shoah Foundation, but I do know that the Jewish community is contracting, and I do know that these stories need to be told so that our girls can have them as their heritage and as their and to own them. Even though they come from girls from all different denominations, the stories are all very similar in terms of the kind of stories we tell. And so girls learn, and the audience and the honorees learn, that these stories are universal. Um, and I would just finish by quoting one of our girls in her impact statement. And she said, "You can never know another person's story unless you ask." And
Mm.
so I'm really thrilled that we have this program, which I hope will continue. We'll find funding for it in some way, and we'll keep it going.
Great. Thank you so much, Susan, for sharing your experience, which is, one way to bring oral history into the community. There are certainly other ways. We do have a question from Michal, who asks if any of the girls chose women who were on the periphery or facing challenges within the Jewish community. Perhaps they were immigrants, they were at-risk women, they had a disability, or were agunot. So if there was anyone who sort of fit in that category, and how you prepared the girls for that, if so.
Well, two of our girls told the stories of women who survived the Holocaust. One of them was on the Kindertransport. One of them was in a concentration camp. Um, uh, I There is nobody who would be in any of those other. And then we talked about their own personal challenges. Auntie Bobby had a double mastectomy, so each of the girls I know confronted learning about challenges in the life of the woman they interviewed, and in that
But
way, everybody's story is unique.
yeah, so and I really appreciate Michal you asking that question, and Susan you sharing a little bit about that. I think that is something that's important. So it's something that you want to think about as an educator when you're framing a project like this, to think about the stories that your students are going to have access to and how you prepare them and give them some language about that. And also remembering that those stories are an opportunity to understand all of those issues a little bit more, do some external research, maybe talk to some other people about it. It's definitely, good thing to sort of call out and hold up.
Right. One of the girls actually interviewed her relative who was at Woodstock, who did drugs, who, this was an aunt, an older aunt, who did things that this girl, her, knows are not good things to do. And she felt that by learning that, first of all, she was very, very surprised, but it brought her closer to her aunt, and it made their relationship even more deep and compelling. So one of the things that we do when we do the training for the interview is, once again, we put out the idea of those open questions and tell the girls, let the story flow. And that's one of the big things that the girls work on, is letting that story flow so that they can get, the whole story, and and learn from it. Yeah.
Great. So I'm putting a link here in the chat, and we're going to wrap up here pretty soon. But before we go, um, I think it's really important for us to give our students in all, whether we're teaching about oral history or something else, a chance to reflect a little bit on their learning. So what I've done is I've put a link to a Lino board in the chat here. And so for those of you who have been on our programs before, you've used this, so you just click on that link, and it takes you to a Lino board. And we've got this is a great online tool that you can use with your students, or if you're doing remote learning. And basically what I'd like you to do is choose a green sticky note for a question that's sort of on your mind about some of the things that we've talked about, and a yellow sticky note for an idea that you have about moving this forward in your community. And so you click on that, you type in your question or your idea, and sign your name so we know who it's from, and then it'll get posted to the board. And if you want to see the responses that people are sharing, you can go ahead and click refresh on your web browser. And we can sort of throw some ideas up here about how to move forward from this, how to move forward from this program. Okay. Okay, so Lisa's saying she can't see the link, so let me launch the link pod and maybe you can get it that way. Great, so here are a bunch of links. I'm about to put the Lino into this link, or into the pod here. So you can go ahead and click on that and launch the Lino board that way. And I just want to see a couple responses up here before we head out, just to get a sense of where people are at the end of this program. And I'm going to put some up here too. Okay. So I'm going to leave the Lino open, and those of you that are still here should feel free to go and post on it. And I want to be respectful of your time, so I'm also going to wrap up here. It's 2 o'clock. So I just want to thank all of you for the time that you've spent here with us today, and I want to thank you also for sharing in this work with us. In the web links pod that I've launched, we have 5 different links of resources. So the first one is for the National Educators Network. You can go ahead and click on that link to join our Facebook group, which is a great place to share with other educators around the country, share about what you're doing, ask questions. There are lots of people who have done story and oral history collecting projects in that group, so picking their brains for ideas and sharing your work. We have a new program that we started this year that we're going to be kicking off in 2 or 3 weeks called the Meetups program. And that's going to be, it's an evening program where it's discussion based. So instead of someone from JWA or a guest speaker coming in and teaching, it's really I facilitate a conversation that is participant driven around different ideas about the one that we have that's upcoming is about the role of the Jewish educator in teen education and sort of look how do we facilitate the exploration of identity, Jewish identity for teens. Um, our entire online learning calendar for this whole year is up. So you can register now for those programs. Our next program will be about collective action and lessons from the labor movement, I think, which is also in early December. And the important thing is this fourth link here, the short feedback survey. If you could take that and just give us some feedback on how the session went for you today. You'll also get a follow-up email with that link in it, and your feedback helps us improve these programs for the future. So with that, I leave you to enjoy the rest of your day, and since I won't be seeing you next week, happy Thanksgiving and happy Hanukkah. And thanks so much for coming. We'll be sending all of this in a follow-up, all the resources from this in a follow-up email on Monday morning, so you can expect it from us then. Thanks again for coming, and we look forward to seeing you all at a future program. Be well.